My name is Jessica, and I have a story to tell, a story that might shock some of you and perhaps even make others question my decisions. But this is my truth, one I've kept hidden for far too long. It's time to come clean. I need to start by saying that no, this isn't some wild tale of outrageous behavior or explicit scandal. This is about love, loneliness, and how a simple connection went terribly wrong. So, let's rewind a bit. I met my husband, Richard, when we were both fresh out of college. He was 28, driven, and the kind of man who could walk into any room and command attention. I was captivated by his charm and ambition. Our early days together felt like something out of a romantic movie, dinners under the stars, spontaneous road trips, and laughter that echoed late into the night. Fast forward almost a decade, and life wasn't so picture-perfect anymore. We lived on a quiet farm in the heart of rural Ohio, surrounded by rolling hills and fields of corn. The tranquility of our surroundings was a stark contrast to the chaos that had seeped into our marriage. Richard's job as a regional sales manager required him to travel frequently, leaving me alone to manage our small farm and care for our two children, Lily and Ethan. At first, I understood that his work was important, but as the months turned into years, his absence took a toll on our marriage. We grew distant, barely talking for days at a time. When we did communicate, it was mostly surface level, "How was your day?" and "What's for dinner?" But underneath it all, I was lonely, craving attention and companionship to fill the void Richard had unknowingly left in my life. Our farm was home to a few chickens, a couple of goats, and our beloved horse, Midnight. Midnight was a magnificent black stallion, a gift from Richard for our 5th wedding anniversary. He had a gentle temperament and seemed to understand emotions better than most people. I had always loved horses, and Midnight quickly became my confidant during Richard's frequent absences. I would spend hours in the stable, brushing Midnight's coat and talking to him about my day. It might sound strange, but animals have a way of sensing when you're hurting. Midnight would nudge me gently with his nose, as if to say, "I'm here, you're not alone." Over time, those moments with Midnight became the highlight of my days. I found myself pouring my heart out to him, sharing things I couldn't even tell Richard. Midnight was patient, never judgmental, and always there. I know what you're thinking, how could I compare a horse to my husband? But you have to understand that Richard was absent, and Midnight was all I had. The turning point came one summer evening. Richard was out of town again, and I was feeling particularly down. I had just gotten off a call with him, and once again, it felt like we were two strangers living separate lives. I walked out to the stable, hoping to find some peace with Midnight. As I brushed his coat, I started venting about my frustrations, my loneliness, and how disconnected I felt from Richard. I rambled on, not even thinking about what I was saying when suddenly, I realized I was speaking about Midnight in a way that made my heart race. Caught off guard, I shook my head and laughed it off. "Jessica, you're being ridiculous," I told myself. Midnight was a horse, a magnificent one, yes, but still just a horse. I tried to brush off the strange thoughts creeping into my mind, but as the days went on, I found myself returning to the stable more often, lingering longer than I should have and feeling a growing sense of attachment to Midnight that I couldn't explain. I felt guilty. How could I be so emotionally invested in an animal when I had a husband? But the more I tried to push it away, the stronger the connection became. Midnight was always there, and Richard, well, Richard wasn't. The truth is, I wasn't cheating in the way you might expect. There was no physical betrayal, no affair in the conventional sense, but emotionally, I had crossed a line. I had started to confide in Midnight in ways that should have been reserved for my husband. Then one evening, everything came crashing down. Richard came home unexpectedly from one of his trips. I didn't hear him pull into the driveway, and I was in the stable as usual with Midnight. I didn't realize how much time I had spent there or how absorbed I had become in this strange emotional attachment. When Richard walked into the stable, he found me standing next to Midnight, whispering softly to him. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain this without sounding insane? "Jessica, what are you doing?" Richard's voice was sharp, filled with confusion and suspicion. His eyes darted between me and Midnight, as if trying to piece together the scene in front of him. I stepped back instinctively, putting a hand on Midnight's side as if he could somehow shield me from the confrontation that was coming. "It's not what you think, Richard," I stammered, though I wasn't even sure what he thought yet. "Then tell me," he demanded, his voice a mix of confusion and anger. "I come home early, and I find you here, whispering to our horse like he's... I don't even know what. What am I supposed to think?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the words to explain the emotional connection I had developed with Midnight without sounding completely insane. "Richard, you've been gone a lot lately," I started, and I could already see the frustration building in his eyes. "I know it's your job, and I know you're working hard for us, but I've been lonely. Midnight, he's been here for me. He's listened when I didn't have anyone else." Richard threw his hands up in exasperation. "He's a horse, Jessica. You're talking like he's a person." I winced at his words, but couldn't deny that he was right. "I know," I whispered, "but he was there when you weren't. I started to talk to him because I didn't have anyone else. It got out of hand." Richard looked at me, his expression a mix of disbelief and hurt. "So what you're saying is you had an emotional affair with a horse?" The words sounded absurd even to me, but the reality of the situation wasn't as far-fetched as it seemed. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said quietly, tears welling up in my eyes. "I was just so lonely, Richard. I needed someone to talk to, and Midnight was there." He shook his head again, clearly struggling to process everything. "So what are you telling me? That you love him? That you'd rather be with him than me?" His voice cracked slightly, and I could tell that, beneath the anger, there was a deep sense of betrayal. "No, of course not," I replied quickly, stepping forward and reaching for his hand. "I love you, Richard. But I was lonely, and I made a mistake. I let my emotions get the better of me and turned to Midnight when I should have turned to you." He pulled his hand away, pacing back and forth in the small stable. "This is insane. I don't even know how to wrap my head around this. I come home, and this is what I find, my wife confessing some kind of emotional affair with our horse." I stood there helplessly, unsure of how to fix the situation. "Richard, please. It wasn't like that. I didn't do anything physical, nothing inappropriate. I got lost in the loneliness." For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, his back turned to me as he tried to collect his thoughts. Finally, he spoke, his voice much softer this time. "Do you know how crazy this sounds, Jessica? How ridiculous this whole situation is?" I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know, but it's the truth. I let my loneliness cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry. I never meant for it to get this far." Richard turned to face me, his expression softening slightly. "Why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you tell me you were feeling this way?" "I tried," I said, my voice trembling. "But every time I brought it up, you were too busy, or too tired, or just distracted. Eventually, I gave up. I thought maybe this was just how things were going to be, so I found comfort in Midnight. I know that sounds ridiculous, but he was there for me in a way you weren't." He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't know you felt this way. I thought we were fine." "We weren't," I replied softly. "But I didn't want to burden you with it. You were always so busy with work, and I didn't want to seem needy. But the truth is, I needed you, Richard. I needed my husband. And when you weren't there, I turned to Midnight." There was a long silence between us as we both stood there, the weight of the situation sinking in. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't know what to do with this, Jessica. I don't know how to move forward from here." I took a deep breath, feeling the tears spill over onto my cheeks. "I don't either," I admitted. "But I want to fix this. I want to fix us. I love you, and I don't want to lose you." Richard looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and uncertainty. I love you too, Jessica, but this is going to take time. I nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. I know, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. He sighed again, finally stepping closer to me. We need to talk about this, really talk about everything. Not just midnight, but us. Where we went wrong and how we can fix it. I nodded, reaching out to take his hand again. This time, I felt him squeeze it back. I'm ready to talk, Richard. I'm ready to make things right. As we stood there in the stable, the air thick with the weight of our conversation, I realized that this was the first step in rebuilding what had been broken. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Over the next few weeks, we made a conscious effort to reconnect. We started having regular date nights, even if it was just a simple dinner at home after the kids went to bed. We talked openly about our feelings, our needs, and our fears. I began to understand that Richard's work was important, but it didn't have to come at the cost of our relationship. He, too, recognized that he needed to be more present in our lives. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I turned to Richard. I'm really proud of how far we've come in such a short time, I said, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. Me too, he replied, taking my hand. It's not easy, but I think we're finally starting to understand each other again. As the weeks turned into months, we continued to work on our relationship. We even took the kids on family outings, creating new memories together. The laughter returned, filling our home with joy once more. However, I knew there were still underlying issues that needed to be addressed. I decided to take a leap of faith and suggested we attend a couples retreat together. I think it could really help us, I said, looking at Richard hopefully. After some discussion, he agreed. If it means we can strengthen our bond, I'm all in. The retreat was set in a beautiful countryside resort, surrounded by lush greenery and tranquil lakes. As we arrived, I felt a sense of excitement and nervousness wash over me. Throughout the weekend, we participated in workshops focused on communication, intimacy, and trust. We learned valuable tools to help us navigate our relationship more effectively. On the final night of the retreat, we attended a candlelit dinner with other couples. As we shared our experiences, I felt a renewed sense of hope for our future. After dinner, Richard took my hand and led me outside to a quiet spot overlooking the lake. I want you to know how much I appreciate you, he said, looking deeply into my eyes. You've been so brave in facing everything, and I'm committed to making this work. Tears filled my eyes as I smiled back at him. I love you, Richard. I've always loved you. I just needed to find my way back to you. As we stood there, hand in hand, I knew that while we still had a long journey ahead, we were on the right path. We had faced our challenges, learned from our mistakes, and emerged stronger together. So, to those of you listening, I want to say this: relationships aren't easy. They require work, understanding, and a willingness to be vulnerable. But if you're willing to put in the effort, you can find your way back to each other, no matter how lost you may feel. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it resonates with you in some way. Remember, you're not alone in your struggles, and there's always hope for a brighter tomorrow.